This is London. The government have given instructions for the following important announcements. All cinemas, theatres, and other places of entertainment are to be closed immediately because if they were hit by a bomb, large numbers would be killed or injured. Keep off the streets as much as possible. To expose yourself unnecessarily adds to your danger. Carry your gas mask with you always.
When war broke out, Britain expected a massive attack of bombs and poison gas. Children were evacuated from the cities. Hospitals were cleared to make way for casualties. 1 million coffins were prepared. And nothing happened at all. Public entertainment started up again. People stopped carrying their gas masks. Many of the children came home again. And by Easter 1940, most people had stopped being worried about the war.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is a special news bulletin. As listeners to our early morning bulletins will have heard, Denmark has been invaded by German forces and Norway is at war with Germany.
Denmark and Norway were neutral. Norway tried to defend itself. Britain tried to help. But it was all over in 3 weeks. And then Germany struck again.
The German army invaded Holland and Belgium early this morning by land and by landings from parachutes. The armies of the Low Countries are resisting.
More neutral countries. And again the Germans swept aside resistance. And now they tore into France. And the 6 million French soldiers found themselves outflanked and without the will to resist. In just 10 days, the Germans reached the French coast. The British army in France was pushed back onto the beaches of Dunkirk and had to be rescued, leaving their tanks, their guns, their vehicles and ammunition in the hands of the conqueror. Paris belonged to Hitler. France was defeated. Hitler ruled in Oslo, in Prague, in Paris, in Vienna. 140 million people in 10 countries were under the swastika. His empire was bordered by Russia, Italy, Spain, all friendly countries. The war had lasted 10 weeks. And then there was celebration in Berlin. Berliners were sure that Britain would face reality and make peace. But the Germans soon learnt of a new mood of stubborn determination in Britain, voiced by a new Prime Minister.
I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. Let us, therefore, brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
So Hitler would have to occupy Britain too. But how? The German army couldn't cross the Channel in the teeth of the British Navy and Air Force. So the Luftwaffe would have to destroy the RAF. If the Luftwaffe ruled the sky over the Channel, the Royal Navy would be helpless. The RAF had radar to warn them of the attacks. The Luftwaffe began by attacking the radar stations, then turned to bombing airfields. Then, on August the 15th, 1940, came a massive attack on Fighter Command. The Battle of Britain had begun. first, the RAF was very successful. For every one plane they lost, the Germans lost 2 or 3. But by the beginning of September, the tide was turning. British fighter losses now outnumbered the Germans. And on the ground, people watched helplessly as their defenders were destroyed one by one. An appeal had gone out for scrap metal to help replace the planes. And now, more than ever, people needed to feel that they were doing something useful. In fact, there was no shortage of metal. The RAF was able to replace its planes. It was the pilots who were irreplaceable. In 2 weeks, 1/4 of them were killed or injured. And the rest, going into battle up to 7 times a day, were being worn out. On the other side of the Channel, the German invasion barges were prepared. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England, would begin on September the 24th. Hitler appointed commanders to take charge of Britain. Orders were given that British males aged 17 to 45 should be shipped to the Baltic to work as slave labor for Germany. They were so confident of coming that the Germans staged a mock invasion for the cameras. The heroic wounds of the Germans and surrender of the British Army was filmed in advance. While the Germans were faking for the cameras, people in Britain were volunteering to fight the invader. Local defence volunteers, the Home Guard, drilled with whatever weapons they could get. They were usually given rifles, but there was a great shortage of ammunition. A special battalion of the Home Guard formed a secret army, trained to carry on a guerrilla war from hidden bunkers after everyone else in their district had surrendered. But the Luftwaffe didn't know how close they were to destroying Fighter Command, and so they turned to a new target. On September the 7th, they didn't attack Fighter Command. Instead, they came to London. 1,300 fighters and bombers, and the RAF was unable to stop them. To ordinary Londoners, this was the moment when the war struck home.
Here in Stepney Green, we were about a mile from the docks. In 1940, I was about 13 years old. We lived up there. My Aunt Kate lived down there. Aunts and uncles lived all around. Well, when the sirens went, we sheltered my Aunt Kate's house with all the aunts and uncles. People were crying, kids were crying. I was hiding under the table. My mother was screaming. We thought the world was coming to an end.
That night, while London blazed, the alert went out. Code word Cromwell, invasion imminent. Defenders rushed into position. Church bells rang their warning. It was a long and frightening night. But it was a false alarm. The Germans were not ready. And while they continued to bomb London, Fighter Command rested and repaired itself. Then on September the 15th, the Luftwaffe came by day to London to demonstrate their mastery of the sky.
Die englische Küste ist erreicht. Im Tiefflug brausen die Maschinen über englisches Land. Bombenschächte auf. Im freien Wurf sausen die Bomben in die Tiefe. Über dem Straßengewirr von London. Hier liegen dicht beieinander militärisch wichtige Ziele, die zu vernichten sind. Geschwader auf Geschwader. Ihre Kette reißt nicht mehr ab.
As Fighter Command plotted the Germans' approach, squadron after squadron was put up to shoot them down. Eventually, every British fighter was in the air. Soon they'd have to come down for fuel, and there were no reserves to protect them. But the Germans, too, had been stretched to their limit. The daylight attack had come to an end.
Here is the midnight news, and this is Alvar Liddell reading it. Up to 10 o'clock, 175 German aircraft had been destroyed in today's raids over this country. In daylight raids,
it's hard to count planes in battle. In fact, less than 60 German planes were shot down. But the RAF controlled the daylight sky. There had been no invasion. The Germans could only come to bomb in the dark. And for 53 nights they came to London every night. The Blitz. Many Londoners became desperate for shelter. The obvious place to hide was deep in the underground system.
For most of the Blitz, I sheltered down this station. But it wasn't as easy as all that in the beginning. When the Blitz started, these gates were barred to us. We weren't going to be allowed shelter in the underground. When the raids became terrible, people congregated here, thousands of them, all trying to get down this station. I was amongst them, trying to force these gates open. Police came to try and stop us. Then suddenly, a great shout went up, and I saw the gates being opened, and people rushed down. We're going to be allowed to shelter after all. Hundreds of people here. Terrible living conditions, terrible smells, people snoring. But nevertheless, it was shelter here. We did feel secure here. Funnily enough, while this was going on, trains were passing through. One night, I got a train to St. Paul's, and I ventured upstairs. As I got out of the station, I saw the whole city was alight. It was all burning down, and it was very quiet.
Londoners adapted to their strange new world. This view of London at the time was filmed for Americans, still neutral in the war.
London raises her head, shakes the debris of the night from her hair, and takes stock of the damage done. London has been hurt during the night. The sign of a great fighter in the ring is, can he get up from the floor after being knocked down? London does this every morning. Not all the services run as they did yesterday, but London manages to get to work on time, one way or another. In the center of the city, the shops are open as usual. In fact, many of them are more open than usual. Today, the morale of the people is higher than ever before. They know that thousands of them will die, but they would rather stand up and face death than kneel down and face the kind of existence the conqueror would impose upon them.
Throughout that winter, most cities in Britain were bombed. In Coventry, one raid destroyed the centre of the city.
The bombing stopped before dawn, and wherever we looked there was desolation. It was impossible to know where the streets were because the familiar landmarks had gone.
Over 500 victims were buried in a mass grave. And here, as in some other cities, people were too scared to stay where the bombers might return.
Night after night after night, women and children with bundles would go out into the countryside, and I found that horrifying.
But there was no widespread panic. In February 1941, as the Blitz continued, Churchill broadcast to the world.
We shall not fail or falter, we shall not weaken or tire. Neither the sudden shock of battle nor the long-drawn trials of vigilance and exertion will wear us down. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job.
The tools had to come across the sea. Britain could not build its weapons or feed its people without help. There was strict rationing, but the country could never manage without food from overseas, and imported oil, timber, iron, rubber, and other vital supplies. Much came from our own Commonwealth and Empire, but the most vital route of all was the route to North America. The United States was neutral, but it sold Britain the material to stay alive. British ships crossed the Atlantic, bunched together in convoys, protected by destroyers. If German submarines could sink those ships and cut that lifeline, Britain would die. Between March and May 1941, 321 ships were sunk in the North Atlantic. There were not enough destroyers to keep the convoys safe. 50 old destroyers were given to Britain by America in September 1940 in exchange for bases in the Caribbean. Most Americans wanted to stay out of the war, but President Roosevelt was keen to help Churchill. He did more in May 1941 when Britain was offered enormous loans through the Lease-Lend Act.
They are fighting in the front line of civilization at this moment. They need tanks and guns and ammunition and supplies of all kinds. From America, they will get tanks and guns and ammunition and supplies of all kinds.
Britain was holding on, but the war seemed an endless test of endurance. The RAF was bombing Germany back, but it was losing more men than the Germans. Hitler's ally, Italy, was defeated in Greece and North Africa, but then the Germans arrived in force. We were alone until June the 22nd, 1941.
At 4 o'clock this morning, Hitler attacked and invaded Russia. All we know at present is that the Russian people are defending their native soil and that their leaders have called upon them to resist to the utmost. Hitler is a monster of wickedness, insatiable in his lust for blood and plunder.
Britain was no longer alone. She had an ally, and the Germans now had someone else to fight. Precious arms were sent to Russia on the long and dangerous sea route through the Arctic. The German attack was swift, but winter came and it ground to a halt. The Russian war became a slow and terrible agony, bleeding Germany to death. Then America came into the war. In December 1941, Japan and Germany declared war on the United States. 20,000 troops at a time came over on the great ocean liners, and Britain was filled with new confidence. In December 1941, this comic propaganda was being seen on the cinema newsreels. But Hitler was not a joke, and nor were his Japanese allies. On Boxing Day, they captured Hong Kong. In February, they took Singapore. And 4 months later in North Africa, the Germans captured an entire British army, 35,000 men, at Tobruk. But with America, Russia, and Britain fighting on the same side, the scales would have to tilt against Germany. And the moment came in November 1942. In the barren desert of North Africa, by an unknown oasis called El Alamein.
This is the BBC Home and Forces programme. This is Bruce Belfridge. The Axis forces in the Western Desert, after 12 days and nights of ceaseless attacks by our land and air forces, are now in full retreat. Their disordered columns are being relentlessly attacked by our land forces and by the Allied air forces by day and night.